Shama Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
I'm talking with Reverend Charles Cooley today about David's harp, the shepherd David's harp. And Brother Cooley knows a great deal about David's harp, the way it probably looked, the way it probably sounded, even the tools that he used to make it. So, Charles, tell me about how David would have made a harp.
Well, the Bible tells us that he did this as a shepherd, as a young boy, and his resources would have probably been very limited. We're at a time about 1000 BC, which is a late Bronze Age. So would have used Bronze Age tools. His exposure to music would have been from listening to traveling minstrels and possibly have seen harps in caravans, trade caravans. So he had an idea of what they looked like. And I suspect, although nothing is recorded, I suspect that being a shepherd boy, having done woodworking as a child, I suspect that he collected firewood or scrap wood from construction sites in order to make these.
Well, do you think he made the first harp that the Israelites used?
The Israelites used instruments much earlier. There's a drawing in an Egyptian tomb in Beni Hassan that shows Israelites going into Egypt about 1900 years BC, taking a lyre with them. And it is actually believed that the lyre came to Egypt through the Semitic tribes.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And so that's about the time of Abraham.
All right, well then, you said that David was working in the Bronze Age, and I know that you made some tools to build these harps. So tell us about some of those. Some of the tools you actually made.
Well, you wanted me to demonstrate that it could be done. And so in the museum in Cairo, there is an exhibit of Bronze Age tools, and also in the British Museum from about that period. And so I decided to go ahead and replicate the Bronze Age tool. This is a saw that was used in that time. Each tooth is shaped differently, and it's set only on one side, and it cuts on the pull stroke. And I thought that this would be a very difficult and complicated tool to use, but since I started playing with it, I've become very fond of it. It works very, very well. For rough shaping, an adze was used. And you take a limb of a tree, you can take either section of where a limb branches off, and a bronze blade would be wrapped around with a wedge, and this was used as the main shaping tool. You'd have a larger one and a smaller one. Many of the other tools would be very similar to what craftsmen would have in their chest as late as the late 19th century. A mortising chisel made of bronze instead of steel. A firming chisel for shaping, a little lighter in construction. And an awl, some sort of a blade. And then they had drills. The drills would be a little bit odd. You would take a bow, wrap the string around it, and use a cap piece to hold it in place and drill a hole.
How about that?
So a marking awl, and so the tools were very simple, not too many of them, and fairly easily used. The most difficult thing is getting the metal tempered so it'll hold an edge.
Because they had no iron.
Had no iron.
Well, tell me about the kind of woods he might have used.
Okay, there's a Hebrew word. The King James says that David made instruments out of fir. Mm-hmm. And of course, our nomenclature for wood was different than then. The wood was most likely a Italian cypress or a pine. Mm-hmm. There were 4 species of pines in the area. Mm-hmm. And so those were favored in construction. They were favored for firewood or anything. So those would be very much available to him. The cypress especially has very good acoustical properties and fairly easy to work.
In terms of glue, tell me how they got glue, and I'm assuming he put it together with glue, put his harps together with glue.
Again, this is an assumption.
Sure.
There are no instruments that remain from that period, but hide glue from the boiling of hides and hoofs and parts of animals, and as they processed the hides for their use, glue would have been a byproduct. There would have been plenty of it.
Okay. How about the finish? If he finished his instruments, how would he have done that, perhaps?
Well, again, we have no evidence to tell us whether or not he did finish. However, craftsmen used pretty much the same techniques. And we do have evidence of what the Phoenician carpenters used, which would have been the Canaanite people in the area, and of what the Egyptian craftsmen used. And they would have used resins that were readily available to him, which would have been pine resin, a resin from what they called a turpentine tree, which we would call mastic today, and a resin from a little bush they used in incense called benzoin. And these 3 resins are popular even today in handmade violin varnishes.
How about that? And so what would they do once they had the resin? How did they treat it? What did they do to get a finish from that?
Well, I have to use solvents to dissolve it. If I were going to the source, I think it would be better to go right to the tree, get the resin in a liquid form, heat it, and apply it. It could be applied with a piece of wool fleece. It could be applied with a piece of cloth, just be rubbed on.
I see. So just the resin rubbed right onto the wood.
Hot would reduce the viscosity, so it would go on smoothly.
How about that?
Heat it and put it on.
Oh, Claire. Well, we've talked about the woods. We've talked some about the tools. Tell me about the strings. That seems to be a kind of a problem, maybe.
The strings were made of sheep gut, and the way that's made, you take the gut and you boil it and you cut it into strips, and you have to have different diameter strings to get your tones. And so the strings, while they're wet and in this state, basically it's hide glue and collagen. You twist those strings and the number to get the diameter you want, and then when it dried, you would have a string of the diameter you wanted.
How about that? The harps, tell me about the tuning of the harps. I'm concerned because you've shown me some pictures of how they think they did it. How did they actually tighten the string up?
Well, musicologists say that they simply wrapped the string around the yoke and pulled it. It's very difficult to do. And I've rigged a tension meter to do this, and I find that I cannot get and maintain much more than 6 to 8 pounds, which doesn't give you a whole lot of sound. But that's the way musicologists say it was done. There are some drawings on pottery and caves in various different places that show a stick across the yoke. But musicologists say that they just wrap the string around the stick rather than turning it as a tuning key. You have to wonder whether the truth is in musicology theory or make an instrument and see what'll work.
Have you been able to tune a string up that way?
No,
That's what I thought.
I have not yet been able to do it. It pulls on the finger and will actually cut through my finger trying to do it that way. I cannot get it to stay. Sheep gut strings will change with every humidity fluctuation. They probably didn't have that much of that in the Holy Land in the dry season, but around here I can't maintain a tuning doing that. I have to have some sort of a mechanical device, either a tuning pin that I can tune or a lever or something of that nature.
How did you determine how the harp looked? I know that you made a replica of a coin. Tell me how you knew how that harp looked.
People have always wanted to know what David's harp looked like. And over, the last 100 years or so, musicologists have theorized it was like this particular drawing, that drawing, or the other drawing. And with all of those, there were problems. And now that we've identified the dates of some of those drawings, it's a little easier to identify. In Nebo, which is just the other side of the Jordan River from where David lived in Bethlehem, they found a little cylinder seal. It was about this size, and the seal has a lyre player and an olos player. That's a double reed pipe. And if you roll that out on a piece of wax that they would use in sealing, you see an asymmetrical, simple form lyre. Well, all practical logic would tell you, well, first of all, this is from 1000 BC, right time. Secondly, the fact that it is simple, a teenage boy with limited woodworking skills and ability would be able to make a very functional lyre. The fact that it's asymmetrical makes it easier to tune. That is, the longer arms will give you lower strings, going short gives you higher strings. It's not as critical to have an exact diameter on your strings. So I settled on this design because of the simplicity, of the fact that it can be made easily with these tools, and the fact that the Nebo seal, which shows an instrument of this type, and there are a number of other drawings showing the same thing, but being from the right period.
And that's as good a guess as a person can make, I guess.
Well, I think so, yes. There was a fellow, a very elaborate drawing, and a Hebrew man wrote in an Israeli archaeology magazine that this was David's lyre. But this has since been proved by the Israeli Antiquities to be a fraud. This was carved in jasper, and it's a beautiful lyre. I wish this were the correct one, but simply because it's so pretty. But it's also very complicated. It would be hard to make.
I can tell that. Well, I think I'd like to know how the harp would sound, and so why don't we take a break just for a second and come back and let you show us how this harp actually would sound. we're back, and Charles has a very deluxe version of the David's harp, and he's going to string a string, and he's going to tell us about it. Pulling the gut through, as he was telling us about earlier, and he's got the modern, I guess I'm going to call it modern tuners on there in order to get the string up to pitch. And so you can see the process of tuning. And we're not going to bring these strings actually up to the whatever concert pitch would be. But tell me, just as an aside, we were talking while we were on the break, and Charles told me that it was sometimes you couldn't tune the instruments. Tell me that story about on a certain day a man couldn't tune his harp.
On the Sabbath day,
Yeah.
if a string was broken, the rabbis wouldn't let you tune it if you had to tie a knot.
Okay, because that turned out to be
That
work.
was work.
And it was a Sabbath.
Uh-huh. Somehow or another you could play it, that wouldn't work, but you couldn't
tune
put a new string on it.
How about that? And you said they'd play around it. They broke a string, they had to play
Just
around,
play around
the
it.
string.
Well, see, in the temple orchestra, you'd have anything from 28 on the morning talmud and the evening talmud, or 288 on special sacrifice days.
That means that many instruments?
Yes, sir, that many stringed instruments. So if one fellow broke a string, you could still carry on.
That's fascinating. Well, tell us how, show us, well, first thing, tell me about this one. You said this was a special harp. Tell me about it first. Harp of David.
This harp is designed like David's. David started off as a shepherd, then he became a king. He still made instruments. He was interested in designing instruments for the tabernacle, and then when David resigned as king and made Solomon king, he was interested in the instruments for the temple. And the Bible says he made 4,000 instruments. I suspect that means he designed and aided and supervised in the making. Well, when Solomon made the instruments for the first temple period, he used the wood the Bible identifies as almug. Trying to chase that, the Phoenician king Hiram went to an Isle of Ophir, which is somewhere off of the country of India, and it is thought to be red sandalwood. And this is what this instrument is made out of. So I think that the instrument for the temple and for King David was probably a little more sophisticated and a little nicer than for David. But the instrument is still basically the same and operates the same. This is guts, these have gut strings, and
Well, show us how it sounds.
well, let me sing you a little Hebrew song.
Okay.
Shama Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That's
All right.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one.
How about that? And they sing, the accompaniment was almost the same note as you were singing. Or
Exactly.
Yeah.
The instruments were likely tuned in Dorian mode, and the music was likely modal, and not the harmonies like
Right.
we use today.
Right, right.
And it sounds a little strange to the Western ear.
Well, that gives me a really good in, I think, to what you have been doing with providing some harps for some young people who were quite interested. Can you tell me about those persons and how that came about? And then we'll hear them in a concert they played especially for us.
Three young ladies, age 20, 18, and 14, came by the shop with their father, and I have all these instruments sitting around. I had made some of these instruments with nylon strings so that they stay in tune better with humidity changes. They're easier to tune. They're a little bit more rugged. And the girls were picking them up and playing them, and I suggested take them home, see what you can do with them. And that was, about 7 months ago, and in a very short period of time, they've become quite proficient playing their own particular style of music. One is a David's lyre.
Mm-hmm.
One is, I call it a tribute lyre.
Mm-hmm.
It's from the time of Nebuchadnezzar,
Mm-hmm.
when he paid tribute to the Assyrian king Sennacherib. And there's a carving that was on his palace wall. It's now in the British Museum, that shows 3 Israelite players playing that particular instrument.
How about that?
And then the third instrument is a Celtic harp, and it represents all of the, or many of the drawings in Renaissance psalteries, prayer books, Bibles. The art showed angels and David playing that kind of harp. So I kind of want to represent that. And so they represent a period of several different instruments. On the left is Joy Manuel. She is playing the Hezekiah lyre, or the tribute lyre. And she plays counter melodies and chords, and really adds a lot of interest to the work. And she's 20. The lady in the middle playing the Celtic harp is Joanna. She's 18. And she and her sister on the right play melody and harmony. They alternate back and forth because the instruments have a limited range, and so rather than just being limited to what the instrument can do, they've worked out a style where they can play more. And the young lady on the right is Julia, and she's 14, and if she smiles, she's got a lovely smile, and she's a very gifted young musician.
And all 3 are sisters.
The 3 are sisters.
And they work this out on their own.
Yes, they worked out the harmonies, the melodies. Everything has to be transposed to one key because the instruments you can't go sharp and flat.
Right.
And their mother's a very gifted musician, but they've done all of this on their own. It's pure Manuel sister music.
How about that? Well, I think we'll listen a little bit, and then we'll come back and talk about it a bit more. Let's listen to the Manuel sisters playing the harps that Reverend Cooley built. Charles, on the day we went to the church and recorded the Manual Sisters, I was just so impressed by the music. And I've thought about it a little bit, but tell me, you're into this, tell me why it's so special. What do you think?
I've tried to analyze this, and we've been putting on programs in a number of different churches, and everybody is just very much moved by it. One thing you might consider is that when Saul was possessed of an evil spirit, they sought for somebody to play an instrument, and they got David.
That's right.
And David played these instruments, and they would calm him.
Yes.
I don't know whether it's the frequency, the notes, the sounds, the harmonics, or all the mechanism that's going on, but there's just something very, very soothing. It's a simple music. I think the music is very enjoyable because we're playing old hymns and songs that we're familiar with. And you couple that familiarity with the tone quality, the sound quality and harmonies. And it's a very soothing, relaxing music.
Charles, you told me about, with the idea of soothing in mind, you told me about how one church was using the harp music with little kids.
Pastor told me that he was going down the hallway and he heard the CD of the Manual Sisters playing. And he asked the lady in the nursery what this was about, and she said that when she put the children down for a nap or quiet time, she would always play this music, and it seemed to soothe them and quieten them.
Well, I'm sure it did. Okay, let's listen a bit more. Charles, tell me about the man with the hearing problem and the harp. That was a really interesting story.
I met a man with a hearing problem at a meeting, and I have a hearing aid. Well, he had two, and he told me that he had $12,000 in computers sitting on his ears, and that without them he could hear nothing, and with them he could hear very little. His hearing loss is such that he can hear a sound, but he cannot discern or distinguish a tune or a melody.
I see.
Well, later that evening, the Manual Sisters played a couple of pieces at a meeting. He was sitting right down front. He could understand very little, and he had someone signing all the words that were said. But he just started crying when he heard the music. After the service, he told me, I heard music. I could recognize the melodies. I knew what hymns they were playing. I have no idea what the mechanics involved are, but that was one man that was truly blessed.
Well, I know when we made our recording, It was just so peaceful and it was just good in the best sense of the term. Charles, I want to ask you, where do you go from here? You've built a number of these harps, and you've got a trio playing them. What do you plan to do next with the harp?
Eventually, I want to build all of the musical instruments of the Bible. I've built about 60. I want to build them from different historical periods. I've designed the instruments from the book of Daniel, but I've not built those yet. I would also like to build the instruments of the time of the translation of the Bible to show what the people in English had in mind compared to what the real instruments are. But I'm also looking at preparing some of these instruments for Christian schools, seminaries, and Bible colleges. I would like to see somebody go back to try to reproduce music as it sounded back then. Can't do that exactly because it wasn't written down, but we could approximate.
Charles, you've got an example of the work you're moving in closer to the King James period. Tell me about this harp that's partially finished.
Well, this is actually called a Neo-Irish or Neo-Celtic harp. The straight Celtic harp, the back would come back straight and be straight back here.
I got you.
And it would be played off of the left shoulder. And incidentally, the Celtic harp player is called a harper.
Oh, is it?
And
right.
the classical harp is a harpist.
Oh, well, I'm glad to know that.
So, having experience in furniture design, I've used a stave back,
Right.
because I think it's much more attractive,
I do too.
and a very nice bass. Typically, the bass just spindly little legs. Now, this instrument will have a soundboard of Sitka spruce from Prince of Wales Island in Alaska. It's premium soundboard wood. And then, of course, the neck will go up here and the support arm coming back this way. It will have primitive little levers on it so that you can flip them and raise the pitch of a string a half step so you'll be able to play sharps and flats.
And that was not the case with the other harps.
No, that's probably about 1600. About the 17th century when that was developed.
Okay, I got you. Well, one of the things I really did like about this was this area here. I think this is just sublime. I think it's just so pretty. And I look forward to seeing the finished version. Well, Charles, I think we're probably about the end of this journey, but I want to thank you so very much for doing it, for allowing some other people to play it, and for your desire to pass along the music of the harp through your instruments.
It's been a pleasure.